Welcome everyone to our fourth virtual roundtable of the PNET community. There are a few things I need to let you know first before we begin. So all attendees will have their cameras turned off and their microphones muted. Each panelist will have time to develop their ideas and share, and our attendees will be able to ask questions at the end of the discussion. Attendees can ask questions on the chat, and they can also submit their questions to the panelists using the Q&A tool that is located at the bottom of the screen, okay? So we are kicking off the series of virtual roundtables called Life After COVID-19. This will take place every 2 weeks and we'll discuss the post-pandemic trends, the international money transfer and payments industry will see after the COVID-19 restrictions are lifted and life goes back to normal. So today we will discuss FFIEC BSA AML exam manual updates, and we have with us our experts, Brandi Reynolds, who is founder and president at Corcom, Marina Olman, of counsel at Greenberg Traurig, and Dan Wood, payments and regulatory attorney at Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. So with that, I ask that you give your full attention, please, to Dan Wood. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you. So we thought that it would be helpful to begin with kind of a brief overview of MSB exams. And I have a few tips also in here for the Offsite exams that are going on right now, since pretty much all of them are still remote, even in states that are beginning to lift the shelter-in-place orders. So if we want to dive right in, let's check out slide 1. Oh, hey, that's me. All right. So the first thing that, you know, if you're in this industry, a lot of this is going to be old news to you, but maybe you'll pick up a tip here or there. You know, the states, we're going to talk a lot about the FFIEC BSA manual, but just a reminder that the state regulators have really broad authority to examine almost any aspect of your business, but not just your business, your agents, and in some cases your service providers. That's less frequent on the MSB side of things than compared to, say, bank examinations, but it does happen. So there are some things that you should be aware of to be prepared. And for those of you who maybe are newly licensed and haven't gone through this, most regulators will schedule exams anywhere from 6 months to 2 years on a schedule based on your risk profile. And they're going to look at those 5 core areas that are listed on the right-hand side of the slide there. And let's jump to slide 2. Really quickly, like preparing for an exam is pretty common sense. A couple of tips that may be helpful to you. You'll initially get some sort of notice or an entry letter from the regulator. And one of the things that I tell clients all the time is the first thing I would do is find out the name of the examiner in charge and their contact info. If it's not contained on that notice or the letter, get that information and call them, like as soon as you get the notice. The sooner you start opening the door of communication, the smoother the whole experience is going to go. They will probably also give you a list of documents that they're initially requesting. You can take this opportunity before the exam begins to talk to the EIC and ask questions like, are there additional documents or processes you think you might want to look into that you haven't notified us about? Or practical questions like, how big is the team that you're bringing? Is it just one examiner or is it like 3 or 4 people? If it's a multi-state exam, like a joint exam, it might be a large team, and you have to consider things like, do you have a conference room that you can give them? Make sure they have plenty of surge protectors for their phones and laptops and things like that. It's nice to just sort of kick things off that way, I think. And even if they have no special information to give you or special requests, I think they appreciate that. The examiners I know really appreciate that kind of level of consideration. So we can jump to the next slide now, and I'll give you a few tips. So for other financial institutions, like especially banks, doing offsite exams is relatively new, and they still don't like to do that as much. But for MSB regulators, this is kind of old hat. They've been, at least the ones I've talked to, have been doing offsite exams for a while. And in light of the COVID pandemic, not a lot has changed, but some tips that I called two of my regulator friends to ask them how these offsite exams are going. And they just kind of highlighted things you probably already know. Coordination and communication, it's harder when people are not in person. So, you know, when in doubt, just pick up the phone call. Pick up the phone and don't worry about bothering them. You know, communicate in advance of things, especially when they want to conduct, say, interviews of your management. You're going to want to make sure that you schedule that. They're giving as much leeway and being as understanding as they can be. But there are still lots of bottlenecks. Things like video conferencing, for instance. I talked to an examiner in Texas because that's where I used to work. And he told me, for instance, they're not allowed to use Zoom. Because of the security vulnerabilities, the leadership has decided Texas regulators cannot use Zoom. Right now, they've been using Skype. They're going to move to Microsoft Teams, but they're trying to be flexible if the licensee has a different platform they want to use. The Texas examiners are able sometimes to accommodate that, but you want to communicate about that early on, preferably before the exam starts, because they'll need to have their IT department take a look at it, set it up on their computers, make sure that there are no security vulnerabilities they're worried about, and so forth. They can probably make arrangements to use whatever tech platform is preferable to you. If they don't have, you know, the bottom line is you just want to communicate early and often about getting on the same page on these things. I'll also point out that second from the bottom point is something the examiner in Texas brought up to me, which is that they are currently scheduling their all off-site exams through September, but unofficially, they think it's going to go at least through the end of the year. But they are subject to, you know, if Governor Abbott in Texas mandates that the state agencies open up for business, they may have to change that. Or the reverse might happen. We might open up next winter and then a governor comes down and issues a new shelter-in-place order for the state agencies. So just be aware that we're a little bit at the whims of the politicians as well. And then that last point, I shouldn't have to say this, but if you're going to be on a video conference, treat it like an in-person meeting. Apparently, I talked to a bank examiner and two MSB examiners, and all of them had similar stories. In one case, a bank CEO appeared on a video conference for an examination in a t-shirt on his couch, just uncombed hair, you know. Apparently one guy started picking his nose on a video conference, forgot the camera was on. Shouldn't have to say this, but, you know, just pretend like they're in your office. It's not going to negatively affect your ratings or anything, but it just leaves a better impression, obviously. All right, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll give a quick overview of what the exam covers. Many of you probably already fully aware of this. Again, today, my two co-presenters are going to focus on that third bullet point, compliance. But just for those who may not already be aware, the examiners are going to look at your balance sheets. They're going to look at your assets, your transactions, your permissible investments. They're going to take a good look at your policies and procedures, your internal controls, how you manage your agent networks. A key thing that some organizations sometimes struggle with is whatever your policies and procedures are, please make sure you're adhering to them. It's not just a piece of paper that you put in a drawer and take out every time there's an exam. A lot of examiners are going to cite you for a violation if you have a policy or procedure written down that you don't follow, even if that procedure is not required by law. So they're looking for consistency. Another tip I'll mention on the management side of things, they're looking for general character and fitness stuff and making sure that leadership is aligning well with their legal requirements and your policies and procedures and whatnot. But often, a lot of examiners, if there are trouble areas with any of the other 4 bullet points here, they will then also show up under management, right? Because if you're not adhering to your policies and procedures, that's also a sign of a management problem. So you can often get sort of dinged twice for a single violation because it'll show up under finances or policies, but then under management as well. And I'll quickly mention that a lot of states will use a composite rating. So when you get your exam report at the end of the exam, you're going to see, like a scale of 1 to 5. You're rated 2 MSB, say. And then the full report will explain the different areas and where they found citations and whatnot. With respect to banks, they use what's called the CAMELS rating, which is a component rating system. I think there are a handful of states. New York is the one that I know offhand. I think maybe California as well, that also use a component rating system, which will be a little bit different. You'll see a separate rating for each of these 5 categories, basically, and then they give you a composite score that is averaged out of all of these. And so in those states in particular, the effect on your management rating can be very important. So let's go on to the next slide, which is my last one, just as a segue into our next 2 presenters, which is, as I mentioned, the examiners are going to look at your compliance. And what was noted in the slide previous that I didn't mention before, they are allowed to look at your compliance with any applicable law or regulation, not just MSB laws, for instance, not just their own state laws. And I often come across the examiners I know are not too aggressive about looking at your compliance, say with another state's law, but they do want to check on it. So like I get these inquiries sometimes where it's like, all right, we see these transactions happening in Michigan and I'm a Texas examiner and we just want to make sure that you are properly licensed or don't need a license in Michigan. So please give us an explanation of that. So just be aware they can poke around any area of compliance. And that will also include resolution of any deficiencies or citations in previous exams, sometimes even exams performed by other states. So another tip for preparing for any exam is to look at your past exams and make sure that if there were any citations or violations, that you clearly already addressed them, if at all possible. So one of the biggest pieces of the compliance portion of an exam is compliance with BSA AML program requirements. Almost all the states, well, maybe not almost all, but a large number of the states, the statute specifically references the Bank Secrecy Act. And a few of them even reference FinCEN. So, and even the ones that don't refer to the BSA require an AML program. So this is a component that is universal. And almost every state regulator I know uses this FFIEC manual as a blueprint for how they perform the AML examination. So it's very important to be aware of changes in the FFIEC manual when they come about. And that is what my next two co-presenters are going to talk about.
Welcome, Marina.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here presenting with both Dan and Brandi. It's an honor. I'm going to be focusing on the changes to the FFIEC BSAAML examination manual. Joyce, if we can move forward to the next slide. So that's me. So I wanted to start first with just providing some background on the FFIEC. Probably most of you know this, but just some general background as to who the FFIEC is. It is essentially an interagency body that's composed of regulators of federal depository institutions, and also a state liaison committee that's composed of state regulators. And the purpose of the FFIEC is to establish and prescribe principles that ensure uniformity in the supervision and examination of financial institutions. As Dan mentioned, the FFIEC maintains the BSAAML examination manual. The manual is used by examiners to essentially review for guidance when they are conducting their examinations and assessing the adequacy of a bank's BSAAML compliance program. The FFIEC manual was developed in collaboration, close collaboration with FinCEN, and in some sections, specifically the OFAC sections, with OFAC as well. One of the distinctions that I wanted to make was essentially who essentially gets examined under the FFIEC BSAAML manual, and this manual is principally directed to banks. However, as Dan mentioned, your state regulators will review it, and your federal regulators also will review it for guidance. There is a specific BSAAML examination manuals for MSBs, and that's the FinCEN IRS manual that was issued in 2008. That manual has not been updated, but that manual is actually modeled after the FFIEC examination manual. So again, as Dan mentioned, your regulators will be reviewing it, and it's important for you to stay aware and updated of any changes, because that may affect the way in which your examination goes and what aspect gets evaluated. So if we can go to the next slide. So this timeline, I think is a great timeline just to provide an idea as to how the FFIEC examination manual has evolved throughout the years. It was initially issued in 2005. It's been revised a number of times to incorporate new regulations, additional guidance to regulators, etc. Prior to this last revision in 2020, the manual was updated in 2018. That revision was actually pretty, I don't want to say minor, but it wasn't huge in that there's only one section that was updated, and that's the customer due diligence section that was updated, and it was essentially updated to incorporate the FinCEN final rule on the CDD, customer due diligence beneficial ownership requirements for banks. So that was updated in 2018. Prior to that, in 2014, the FFIEC manual was substantially updated. There were a number of updates. A lot of them had to do with the new electronic filing system, but I guess the more substantial included incorporating the FinCEN 2011 MSB final rule covering prepaid access, covering MSB activities conducted by persons outside of the United States. It also included FinCEN 2013 guidance regarding virtual currencies and all of that. If we can go to the next slide, Joyce. Joyce, next slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you. No, prior one. Thank you. Okay, so
sorry.
No, it's okay. So this is where we are today. On April 15th, the FFIEC issued the update to the FFIEC manual. This update, interestingly, was made only to one section of the manual, which is the core examination overview and procedures for assessing BSAAML compliance program section. It's the section that directly follows the FFIEC has stated that they will continue to make updates to the FFIEC manual. These updates to the other sections will be released, however, in phases. It won't all come at once. So we have, our expectation is, to continue to see updates as time goes by. One important thing that I want to mention is that the revisions to the FFIEC manual don't establish any new requirements for examinations, but what they actually do is to explain and clarify to examiners what the methodology should be for examinations. As Dan mentioned, the FFIEC manual is used by examiners. It's directed to examiners. It's not directed to banks. However, for us, the public, it is important information to review and to be aware of, because it provides an idea as to how regulators are understanding and interpreting BSA requirements and what their expectations are. So we can go to the next slide. So this revision, 2020 revision to the FFIEC manual was numerous, I guess. In a way, it was substantial. There were a number of things that were revised, way too many to cover in the seminar. So what I've done is I've picked out the changes that I think are the important changes that we should focus on, that you should know about. So I'm going to be covering based on the sections that were revised. The first section that I wanted to cover is the scoping and planning section that was revised. This section is a section that essentially covers the pre-examination process that the regulators go through in reviewing the bank's risk assessment, prior independent testing, prior examinations, just essentially to review what the weaknesses are, understand what the bank's risk is, and also prepare for the examination or a plan for the examination. The scoping and planning section was expanded to emphasize that examinations have to be risk-based and risk-focused, meaning that whatever examination you conduct for Bank A or financial institution A, it's not cookie cutter. It's not the same examination that you're going to be conducting for Bank B. You have to look at each financial institution independently. You have to plan your examination based on the risks that that financial institution has, whether it's risk on the customer side, risk on the training side, etc., and essentially focusing your time and your resources on the areas that have higher risk. One important item that was included or note that was included in the scoping and planning section, which was interesting, was a mention by the FFIEC to examiners of the fact that an OFAC review may not be required or is not required in every examination cycle. Although personally, I believe that there will be an OFAC review in every cycle. The importance here is that the OFAC review will be, or the depth of the OFAC review will be based on the risk. So for example, if you have a bank that has high exposure to Venezuelan accounts, Venezuelan clients, that bank will definitely be subject to an OFAC review examination in every cycle. And there should be a good amount of time, energy, resources spent on reviewing compliance with that, with OFAC sanctions for purposes of that high risk area. And where you have a bank that is essentially focused on, or it doesn't have any international exposure or international or very little international risk, the OFAC review for that bank should be more general, not as in depth, and would review OFAC just not as in depth as a bank that has higher exposure. So the message here being that, again, based on risk, you have to analyze and understand what the risk is for that bank and plan the examination to cover those risks and test them. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so the next section, or the other section that was updated that I want to point out, two items that I think were revised and are important, is the BSAAML risk assessment. The sections that were revised, the two key items are the first one being that a risk assessment, there's no specific method or format that is expected by an examiner for purposes of a risk assessment. Risk assessments are bank specific. Banks might need to essentially look at their operations and decide what categories need to be analyzed for purposes of their risk assessment. The manual in 2014 had examples of products, services, customers, etc., that needed to be, or that should be evaluated in a risk assessment. This 2020 update actually gets rid of those examples, most likely because those examples are now outdated, and also because the FFIEC is looking for a bank to review what its risks are, to identify them, and to analyze them, based on what their current risk is. The next one, the next point that I wanted to cover is the updating of BSAAML risk assessments. In 2014, we had guidance from the FFIEC stating that it was a sound practice to update the risk assessment period in at least 12 to 18 months. That language has gone away. And the new language essentially says that the expectation is to update it so that you can make sure that your risk assessment is an accurate reflection of the risks that you're currently exposed to as a bank. So essentially, specifically have to be every 12 or 18 months. It just has to be to make sure that you are maintaining an accurate reflection of your risks. So if there's a change in a product, new customers, etc., that needs to be updated as soon as there's any changes to make sure that, again, it's an accurate reflection of your AML risks. Next slide. The BSAAML compliance program section was also revised. I've identified there 4 key points that I think are important just to cover. The first one is that the FFIEC has compliance to the board and to senior management. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting some errors.
I can hear you now. You cut there for just a couple of moments.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so so as I was indicating, there's an expectation that BSA compliance officers regularly report the status of ongoing BSA compliance to the board and management. What's new is that the procedures for this section actually provide that examiners must confirm that there's this presence of the regular reporting. So that's something that's going to be evaluated. That's something that MSBs should also note, because it's something that you may be surprised examiners asking you for those documents showing that there's actual regularly reports. So it's something that you might want to consider documenting if you haven't done so already. Another item that was updated in this section is to cover or ensure that banks are training their agents that they use for BSAAML related functions. And then the last one is also in terms of frequency of independent testing. Whereas again, before the mention was that it was a sound practice to do it every 12 to 18 months, the focus now is on, or the frequency at least, is on the risk profile. Also, the not just the frequency, but the adequacy of your testing should be based on the bank's risk profile, which could be every 12 months. It could be, every 18 months. It just depends. It could be less. There could be certain areas that are higher risk, and those areas you might want to be testing, in less than 12 months, maybe every 6 months, etc. It's dependent on risk. The next slide. Okay, so this is the last slide that I wanted to cover, the developing conclusions and finalizing the exam section, which has also been revised. The key points to take here is that the FFIEC is reminding examiners that banks have flexibility in the way they design their BSAAML compliance program, and that these programs will vary based on the bank's risk profile, size, complexity, and organizational structure. Not only will vary, but they have to vary, and if they don't, we most likely have a problem unless the risks between banks are the same, obviously. It's instructing examiners to focus primarily on whether a bank has established appropriate controls to mitigate risk and whether the bank is in compliance with BSA requirements. And very importantly, it clarifies that minor weaknesses, deficiencies, and technical violations are not indicative of an inadequate BSAAML compliance program. The importance here of this message is that the FFIEC is indicating to examiners to focus on substantial issues, not minor technicalities, substantial issues when deciding whether a BSAAML program is adequate or not. So with that, I will go ahead and turn to Brandi, who's going to cover the expectations following all of these changes to the FFIEC manual.
Great, thank you guys for giving a lot of really good information and details that will be used for my part, where I want to build upon the examiner's new focus. Before I kind of give a deep dive into that, I would like to point out that if you do start comparing the manual updates to the prior versions, there are many things that stand out to me that I really see being focused during the new exams that are going to be taking place with these updates. One of those specifically is the wording choice from effectiveness versus adequacy standard. So in the new manual, you have a lot of changes where now the word is adequate. So to me, the question and kind of food for thought is, do you think the regulators are lowering expectations with these new updates? And so I will kind of let Dan maybe kind of think on that, and Marina as well, if they have any thoughts that they would like to respond to that during the Q&A. You guys may have some thoughts of your own in the audience. So first, as a first step, the examiner needs to understand the bank's risk profile to tailor the examination plan. The updates emphasize the examiners should take a risk-focused approach to tailor the review of a regulated institution's BSAAML compliance program, meaning the examination should be tailored to the risk of that specific institution. I always guide clients and MSBs specifically that the ideal is for you to have your own BSAAML risk assessment at hand. Otherwise, the examiners will create a risk assessment for you, and that's what they'll use as their basis. So the manual instructs examiners to tailor that exam to the risk profile. The manual updates incorporate guidance on more recent developments, such as customer due diligence, as well as beneficial ownership requirements to those that applies to. Importantly, the manual reminds examiners that banks have flexibility in the design of their BSA/AML compliance programs, and that minor weaknesses, deficiencies, and technical violations alone do not indicate an adequate program. So you just heard a little bit about that earlier, but to me that's a very big change, whereas companies may not necessarily come out of an exam with a lot of violations and issues based now upon these new standards. Okay, next slide, please. So the examiner should assess the adequacy of the institution's BSA/AML compliance program and risk assessment process. This includes identifying the specific risk categories that are unique to those institutions and analyzing the identified information to assess the risk within those categories. So the manual notes, however, that there is no particular format or method for an institution or a bank to use for its risk assessment process. And it reiterates that risk categories may vary based upon a bank's size, complexity, and organizational structure, and that updates may occur as necessary to align the risk assessment with a significant change in the risk profile. Now, the examiner's focus will be now quantity versus quality. So that's something very important to remember as you all are completing your risk assessments, and as you do update those, the examiners are going to have a focus on what type of quantitative data you have to support those risk assessments. So some of the areas that the manual updates suggest that the examiners consider during their review would be the risk assessment, independent testing or audits, analysis and conclusions from previous examinations. That's where it's handy to have a log of all of your prior audits and examinations with any type of management action plans. The management's responses, including the current status of the issue. They'll look at the bank's information technology sources, your reporting requirements, such as SARs, CTRs, or CTR exemptions, correspondence between banks and regulators, or between an MSB and their regulators. If appropriate, they'll review the bank's policies, procedures, and processes for OFAC compliance. Next slide. So the manual reminds examiners that banks have flexibility in the design of their BSA/AML compliance programs, and that minor weaknesses, deficiencies, and technical violations alone are not indicative of an inadequate program. So you've heard us mention this many times, and that's because this is extremely important, where you oftentimes hear examiners or auditors try to see a one-size-fits-all approach. As many, especially in the fintech space, MSBs, there's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all approach. So you do have flexibility to really create your own program, and that is really the focus of these examiners. They really need to see that you have customized the program with the details that are specific to your business. So violations or deficiencies can be caused by a number of issues, including but not limited to not appropriately assessing the risk profile, a lack of coherent policies or procedures, a disregard of regulatory requirements or policies, compliance programs not commensurate with growth and higher risk operations, products, services, customers, and geographic locations, insufficient staffing, and insufficient communications of policy changes to staff. So keep in mind that the tone at the top of the organization should be compliance driven, and the information should flow down from senior management. So examiners should not criticize a bank solely because of the number of SARs or CTRs filed if it is lower than the number of SARs or CTRs filed by peer banks. However, as part of the examination, the examiners should consider significant changes in the volume or nature of those filings. So for example, you should not have any criticism because you only had 4 SARs or whatever the number may be in the prior year. What the focus should be on is that consistent with your growth, with the trends, with your transaction monitoring, with what you're seeing and have developed for your specific program to your organization. Okay, next slide. Okay, examiners should discuss with preliminary conclusions, which may include strengths and weaknesses, any deficiencies or violations if applicable, and what the necessary remediation of those deficiencies or violations are. So this is something that has pretty much stayed the same for the examiner's focus. These are things that they should have been doing. It's really what they should be still doing in practice. Now it's just the focus will be on the effectiveness versus the adequacy standard that we did discuss earlier. So the final findings regarding the adequacy of the bank's BSA AML compliance program should be summarized in writing. And the updated sections of the FFIEC manual are intended to clarify the expectation of examiners as covered financial institutions implement their BSA AML programs and procedures. And I say they're intended to because I think that there are still some areas that could offer some more clarity. Which is important to note that there are additional updates that are being made to the manual. They were not all rolled out at one time. The agencies are emphasizing that the updated manual has been in process for an extended period of time and should not be interpreted as new instruction, just as an increased focus. And again, additional updates will be phased out at a later time. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this slide here, I thought had some interesting points. And it's really, what is some of the information here and then the implication thereof. So examiners shouldn't confuse minor weaknesses with inadequate oversight. So my question for just a thought-provoking question, if you will, is perhaps would this result in less critical reviews from the examiner? So again, are we relaxing standards? Will the examinations be, quote, easier, less effective? And then where does that put the US in comparison to other jurisdictions across the world? Examiners given more guidance on risk-based evaluation criteria. So the implication, so is this, how does this impact the entity where they must ensure that it has validation for its risk-based client management program? So again, the focus will be changed in regard to the risk assessment, how that's looked at by examiners. And so what implication does that have for your organization? Okay, so since those are some thought-provoking questions, we can move right into our next section here with the last few minutes that we have for our Q&As. And I do believe we have a couple that were already entered here. So we do have a question for Dan. Are examinations continuing with shelter-in-place orders that are in effect?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. The bank examiners have been pushing off some exams or waiving certain portions of exams. So they're doing like safety and soundness, but maybe not management exams. But MSB examiners seem to be going forward as normal. However, with everybody working from home, their schedule may be a little bit slower than usual.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have one here for Marina. Is the FFIEC BSA AML examination manual used in the examination of MSBs? And before she answers that, if anyone does have any questions, you can feel free to raise your hand using the raise your hand feature. You can type in the question, or if you would just like to speak up after this, I will pause for a moment.
You can hear me, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, excellent. So the answer to this question directly, so the FFIEC BSAAML examination manual is directly used in the examination of banks. So banks, federal, right, at the federal level, banks, savings and loan associations, credit unions, branches, agencies, and rep offices of foreign banks. For MSBs specifically, there is the FinCEN IRS BSA/AML examination manual. As I mentioned, was issued in 2008. It has not been updated. However, as I mentioned earlier, this manual was prepared and modeled after the FFIEC manual. So any changes that take place to the FFIEC manual, it's important to know for MSBs to know about them, because it could definitely affect the way in which the IRS will examine MSBs.
Great, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions that you would like to ask versus typing those in? I'll give a moment now.
We have one.
Okay, let's see. Okay, Christian, you can go ahead and ask your question. And I may not have the ability to give
Christian,
you.
I already unmuted your mic.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Don't worry.
No, just a quick question. Hi, Brandi. How are you?
Hey, good, thanks.
I wanted to find out if in the updates that were made to the to the examination manual, are they obviously not in heavy detail, but high level? Did they put to standardize kind of the documentation that examiners need to ask to review each category?
So when you say standardized documentation, you mean in the pre-planning phase? So the documentation that they would be requesting from the financial institution in order to identify what the risk is?
Yeah,
so there's
how they would review, kind of to standardize, yes, as part of the request, what do they ask, what documentation do they ask to review?
Right, so the expectation is for them to be asking for a risk assessment, prior audits, for them to look at prior examinations and the results of those examinations, also responses, management responses to deficiencies that were found in audits. One very interesting and I think is important also factor that they're looking at is they want to look at the history of your reporting, like SAR CTR reporting, as Brandi also mentioned in her presentation. And they want to see, essentially with all of this, they want to see where the risk is and where the bank or the financial institution is vulnerable, so that they can make sure that they analyze that area, which is a higher risk area, in depth, and they can identify whether the controls that are in place are actually working or whether there's deficiencies.
Okay. And okay. No, I mean, I understand the obviously what they're looking for, but I was trying to see if maybe it got a little more granular into what documentation they want to see. Like, for instance, I'm giving an example. Okay, you know, the bank or the MSB, depending on who is being examined, has a policy that says annually that they update their program. You know, a typical request would be, all right, then we want to see board minutes that show the approval of those of that program annually.
Right.
So it's more like I know what they're looking for, but if there's like a standardized document request.
So I think it provides examples for documents that need to be requested and highlights the important ones. I don't think you're going to see the FFIEC manual getting into that level of detail, just to make sure that it's not restricted. So anything that's included there would be essentially an example, and it's again based on risk. So if the examiner sees that you have a history of, or the institution has a history of not, having this control in place, meaning adopting changes or having the board adopt all of these changes to an AML compliance program, then that's something that they will definitely be asking for. So essentially, you have to look at your compliance history and where you've had gaps and where you've had issues, and make sure that you have mitigating controls for those, you're testing them, and you have documents to show that you have tested them and that they're now being effective and they're working well.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure.
Great, so here's another question. Let's see, are the changes meant to be new requirements that financial institutions must comply with? And the answer is no. There was clear guidance that these are not actually new requirements, but this is just more clarification versus new requirements. Although, again, I personally do feel that some of the changes are a little more confusing than not, but nonetheless, there are no new requirements in these the recent version. Okay, let's see, a couple more questions here. So how does the removal of 12 to 18-month risk review wording affect customer risk reviews? For example, when a customer's actions substantially change. Dan, would you like to take that question?
Sorry. Let me answering a text message. How does the removal of the 18-month risk review wording affect customers' risk reviews, for example, when the customer's actions substantially change? I'm not sure yet how that will play out, to be honest.
So Dan, if I can add just some thoughts,
Yeah.
I think whenever you're looking at any significant change, whether it's in a customer's behavior or customer profile generally that you're exposed to, that's definitely should require a review of the customer. You need to reassess the risk that that customer is presenting to the institution, and whether your controls are effective to mitigate that risk. And if not, whether your controls need to be updated to mitigate that risk. So I think essentially any change that it's out of the ordinary or substantial, as you mentioned, should definitely trigger a review. Does that answer the question? Another person that presented it, but.
I mean, that was an anonymous question presented, so I am not certain who asked that. But you can feel free to tap in additional clarity, and we will definitely get more detail to you if need be. We have 2 minutes left, so I would like to try to address one more question here. So what is your best advice on preparing or aiding examiners who are about to examine a bank that services MSBs, but who do not have a grasp on what MSBs are? Oftentimes examiners have no clue. So I'm not sure if Dan and Marina, if you'd like to address that quickly, and then that will be the last question that we have for today. However, we can continue to address questions offline after the virtual roundtable ends.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think one of the issues that banks have that service MSBs is that MSBs, present a certain level of risk. I think that examiners will definitely be looking at that as you see in the updates on a risk-based basis. So I think there's a possibility that MSBs should be prepared to present even additional documentation that your bank is requesting, whether it's regarding your compliance program, regarding your risk assessments, your audits, or risk profile, because I think it's likely that examiners will be looking at that. You are right, a lot of them do not have a grasp of what MSBs are, and it is definitely a challenge. But I think, and Dan, you can feel free to add to this, but I think communication, as Dan was mentioning in his presentation, is very important. And working together to essentially provide the information that's being requested.
Yeah, I'll add quick. One thing I would probably try to do is ask bank examiner to basically go back home and talk to one of his agency's MSB examiners. You know, most MSBs, I think, are examined by the same agency that examines banks. It should be easy for them to do some internal communication. I used to work for the Texas DOB, and that's often what I would see happening is the bank examiner would come back with a question about an MSB, and we would direct them to, you know, the non-depository examiners, or sometimes the lawyers would take it. But you know, it just basically, yeah, communication. Make sure that if it seems like they're getting stuck on something, just say, look, we could get our lawyer on the phone, we could get our compliance person on the phone, or you can just talk to one of your MSB examiners or someone on your side and sort of work it out. You're welcome.
Okay, so that is the end of our presentation today. We thank you all very much for your time and participation. Feel free again to follow up with us if you do have any additional questions.
Thank you very much, Brandi.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Dan. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this interesting discussion. And thank you very much to our amazing panelists. Have a wonderful day. I hope to see you soon, in 2 weeks for our next virtual roundtable.